from my left.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, Committee. I'm Dan Jarvis, and I'm the Security Minister.
I'm Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Matt Collins, Deputy National Security Advisor.
You're very welcome. Thank you for being with us. The National Security Strategy features all sorts of quotable comments, but one is its recognition that we are facing dramatic changes in the world order and radical uncertainty. Given the government has made clear claim that its first priority is the protection of its citizens, in the 6 months since the strategy was first published, what single action has the government taken that has improved the security of the UK most, or has made the largest operational difference? CDL.
Well, thank you, Chair, for that question. And I think the National Security Strategy, when it was published, has accurately predicted the world in which we are living today, hence why it's such an important strategy at the centre of government. I don't think what I would want to do is quantify individual interventions from the government, but you can point to a few, the work that the government's been doing to support efforts in Ukraine, the relationship between our Prime Minister and President Trump on action within NATO and on other issues around the world. I think Britain has been showing not just that it is able to contribute individually around the world as an important partner in NATO, but is continuing to show that British diplomacy has real value, both for our own interest and in partnership with our allies. So I would kind of point to lots of issues over the last 6 months where I think the government can rightly be proud of the contribution that it's made to protect British interests and have a positive impact on the world.
It's interesting, we'll come back to the point about sort of how our NSS sits, because of course it was published prior to the United States NSS, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about the divergence between the two. In terms of governance of the delivery of the national security strategy, what is the top level governance that has been put in place? Because we had hoped to see DSIT here today, and I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on the role of DSIT in the delivery of the NSS.
On the first part of your question, Chair, the ultimate responsibility is with the Cabinet, and then strategically that's obviously discussed at the National Security Council as the relevant Cabinet subcommittee, with the official level grouping doing the implementation work and facilitating our kind of conversation as political leaders and members of the Cabinet. DSIT, as you and the committee know, is an important part of the work that we do, whether it's on telecoms, online regulation, the role of advanced technologies from the AI Safety Institute and other important policy areas that the department leads on. And as is often the case with cabinet subcommittees on particular agenda items, different parts of government will come together to discuss the work that the departments are doing and it adds up to delivering against the national security strategy.
But I mean, when it comes to the economy, it's quite clear. When it comes to business, it's quite clear. Education, it's quite clear. There is the definition of the department is absolute and is obvious. But when it comes to security, it really does work across all departments. And the concern is that we haven't yet got a grip of it. Going back to my question about how central do you think DSIT is going to be in the delivery of the NSS?
I think the department is important and will continue to be important, but you're right that security and resilience questions run across lots of departments across government. The committee will know, to take resilience as an example, we coordinate through the National Security Council on resilience across government, but departments as delivery vehicles front the work that they're doing, bid for the funding for that from the spending review, and then come back together around the National Security Council table to make sure that collectively we're delivering against our joint strategy. So it does feel and look a bit different to, for example, performing the electives waiting list in DHSC, because by design it involves lots of departments contributing to the wider effort.
I think when we've heard from witnesses, there is a sense that there are some interesting ideas and kind of concepts in the strategy, but actually getting to grips with delivering the NSS is not clear at all. So who's actually going to be holding the different departments to account? It's not the NSA, is it? Is it yourself?
It's the National Security Council, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. And then there are, on resilience, for example, I chair the National Security Council on resilience on behalf of the Prime Minister. So it's ultimately the leadership of those cabinet subcommittees that is accountable for making sure that we're delivering against the strategy.
And so those departments report back to the National Security Council?
Yes.
And how often does that sit?
We sit on average, Matt, once every...
Probably once a month.
And the minutes of those council meetings?
They're routinely kept private because of the nature of the conversations that we're having.
But they could be shared with us.
I think the arrangement is to share the some of the agenda headlines of what the committee's working on, so you can see the topics that are being discussed, but not to share the minutes themselves.
My understanding is that hasn't yet happened.
Oh, okay. Well, we should take that away. My understanding is that you were allowed to see, I think not to be published, but the committee could see the agenda items. It's certainly the case when I was a member of this committee in the past. And as far as I'm aware, that's not changed. So if there's been a problem with that, we can make sure that is sorted.
Well, thank you. That's very welcome. CDO, you have a significant number of responsibilities. I think you're the right-hand person to the Prime Minister, as well as heading up the Cabinet Office. And essentially you're responsible for national security. How much time are you actually able to commit to something as important as this, given we are at such an important inflection point in our national security?
Well, the first thing to say in terms of my time, I work on national security issues pretty much every day in government, either directly with the Prime Minister in meetings in Number 10, or in my capacity as CDL in the Cabinet Office, including, for example, on the National Security and Investment Act processes that we are responsible for being the decision maker on. But you are right to point to the fact that given the portfolio I've been given, I wanted to make sure that we had additional ministerial capacity in the department to help, and that was the reason I asked for Dan Jarvis to be made a joint minister between the Home Office and the Cabinet Office to ensure that it wasn't just me, but alongside the Security Minister, working together to make sure that we are putting all of the time that we need to into that work.
Give us a flavour. How often would you, in a typical month, how often would you meet with the NSA?
The NSA, I would meet probably weekly at least, either informally and or in official meetings, but I also meet with the deputy NSAs frequently too, probably on average once a week as well. And that's in addition to me being in the room for certain discussions and certain meetings, having oversight of certain intelligence functions, and then being the decision maker for the National Security and Investment Act.
Okay, 10 days.
Thank you very much, Chair. I now want to delve into how the national security strategy itself will be funded. Now, we all know that there is pressure on public finances. We need to get the public on board. We need to get the Treasury on board, more importantly, it seems. We found within defence that we still, despite this unstable environment and a more unpredictable world, we still haven't been able to chart a way to reaching 3% of GDP spending on defence, for example. Now, with respect to national security strategy, Chief Secretary, how do you plan to influence His Majesty's Treasury about funding long-term national security and resilience priorities?
Well, thank you. In my previous role as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, we changed the way in which the national security strategy bidded into the spending review process. Because I was very conscious when I was at the Treasury that you had, as a result of the design of departments being responsible for delivering, line items about national security in each department's bids, but not one unified bid coming into the Treasury. Mm-hmm. So one of the changes I made to the spending review last year was to ask the National Security Secretariat, and Matt in particular played an important role in this, in coordinating across government a joint bid for the national security into the spending review, so that, as is the case across all forms of spending review submissions, you can't afford to do everything, but it meant that there was an agreed view and an NSC level discussion about the timing and sequencing of those spending commitments. So that's already happened, and that was in the settlement in SR 25. Of course, the next spending review is due next calendar year in 2027, and so once the Treasury confirms the timelines for that, I suspect departments will start to do that work again for the years from 2029-30 for day-to-day spending and 2030-2031 for capital spending.
Well, Chief Secretary, I'll take on board what you just said there, and I also note that the Prime Minister has said on umpteen occasions that they're taking defence and security issues very, very seriously. However, some of us feel that we are just not meeting the moment, and that we are not, as a nation, given what's going on with Donald Trump and what he's saying about Europe not being a focus for him anymore, given the continued aggression from Russia, are people in government taking this as seriously as yourself and the Prime Minister? When are we going to chart out a way to 3% spending on GDP for defence?
On the first part of the question, government absolutely takes this seriously. I've not seen any suggestion otherwise. And to go to my first answer to the Chair, I think there's lots that the government can be proud of in terms of the value it has brought to the table on these issues, both domestically with our European partners, within NATO, internationally, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in support of Denmark more recently and others. That shows how seriously the government takes these issues, but also how much work the government is doing around the world. On your question of defence spending, the trajectory to 2.6% by 2027 was, of course, allocated at previous fiscal events. That's mapped and will be spent. The commitment to get to 3% of GDP in the next spending review will be something that will be set out in the allocations in the 2027 spending review. And, of course, we have the commitment to go further in later years to 5% when you include some home resilience funding.
So in the next spending review, you will be setting out how you're going to get to 3%?
Yeah, so the next spending review will set out the annual RDEL and CDEL allocations for the department in the normal way. But I should say that the Defence Investment Plan, so I chair the Defence Oversight Board on behalf of the Prime Minister, the Defence Investment Plan will chart a longer term view about the increased trajectory in spending. So there'll be a commitment to the increased spending before the departmental allocations are made in pounds and pence at the next spending review.
Right. And also, Chief Secretary, how are you going to make resilience spending more palatable to the public? We all know that if you do not get our constituents on board, it's very, very difficult to achieve any priorities. So can you set out how exactly that will be done, and are there any recent successes that you can learn from?
Well, I think on the broader question, we have to bring the public with us if we're going to increase the proportion of public spending on defence and security issues. There's no question about that. The public are understandably looking at the world and are anxious about what they're seeing and reading about. And as the Prime Minister made clear, I think in a press conference 2 Mondays ago, we see a very clear connection between our role internationally, what that means domestically, whether it's in relation to security of energy supplies or the cost of food in the supermarkets. So we will continue to make the case as to why this is important and make sure that when we are increasing spending on, for example, defence manufacturing, we're doing so in a way which creates the best growth opportunity, jobs and pay opportunities for companies in the United Kingdom.
They'll then be okay with cuts to other public services, because I think that's where you might get some friction.
Well, the overall size of public spending is increasing, but the proportion going to defence as part of that increase is higher than it would have been in the past, especially on capital spending.
Right. And on to the Security Minister, if I may. Can you just outline for us what new investments and projects do you envisage within the 1.5% spend on security and resilience beyond the day-to-day business as usual spending?
I mean, we're looking very closely at that. I mean, but let me just re-emphasise the point about the importance of bringing the public with us. It's very interesting to look at examples from other countries, whether that is Finland, Sweden, France, Germany, Estonia and others. The difficult job that we have to do is make sure that we've got appropriate levels of resource to meet the moment that you rightly talk about. That may well involve making some difficult changes and some difficult prioritisation around downstream. But what we've got to do is ensure that the capabilities that we put in place and resource are matching the nature of the threat that we face. And that is a rapidly evolving threat. And it is a threat, of course, that we have to deal with alongside our allies. So we're looking very closely at the 3% and the 3.5% and the 1.5% to make sure that we are matching the capabilities we need alongside the nature of the threat, whilst at the same time aligning that activity with our allies.
I think we'll all agree with that, and but I just want to go back to the original question, which is, what new investments and projects will the government be undertaking?
I think you might be referring to kind of wider investments around resilience to ensure
Yes.
that our infrastructure, that our society is more resilient to face the range of threats that we face. And that's something that I now have responsibility for in the Cabinet Office. There are a range of different threats that we are seeking to defend against. But we'll look very closely at the resource that we have available and make sure that it's matched in the most appropriate way to counter the threats that we face.
Okay, so there aren't any investments or projects that you can actually inform the committee of today, so that would have been good. And perhaps there might be a written note on that in due course so that we can then interrogate that. Chief Secretary, if I can come back to your good self. Now, you told us in the letter that you recently wrote to us that you plan to achieve the 1.5% target by 2027. How much do you plan to be achieving by the end of this year, by the end of 2026?
I wouldn't want to guess the accurate number. We should try and get that from the Treasury for you. But I think the important point in the letter that you refer to was that based on the Treasury numbers that we have, with the combined definition of core defence plus national resilience, we're estimating to get to 4.1% of GDP in 2027, which shows, I think, how much money we're spending more broadly on national resilience, whether it's from kind of on technology and information security or undersea cables or natural resilience from issues like flooding.
Okay. What I'm actually quoting is that, as you've written, as the Prime Minister has previously set out, we expect we will reach the 1.5% target by 2027. So you are confident of reaching that target, and
yes, we're confident of reaching the target. What I don't know the answer to is what percentage we think we'll get to by the end of calendar year 2026.
Perhaps
if you'd like to know that, we can get that for you.
We could follow that up.
thank you, Chair.
Lord Hutton.
Yeah, just a couple of very quick ones. On national resilience, does the 1.5% spend the government's committed on, is that just going to cover civil preparedness, or is that going to also deal with military capabilities?
My understanding is it's broadly civil preparedness.
Yeah.
Military is in the core defence spending definition.
And you're going to follow the NATO definition for what resilience is.
Yes.
Will you be able to give us a breakdown for example, how much might be spent on, let's say, preparing for natural disasters as opposed to hybrid threats or armed attacks? Because resilience is a very, very broad category. If we're going to give this any kind of sense of meaning and the sense that we are dealing with the threats we're facing, the public is entitled, is it not, to a little bit more information than just a notional 1.5%, which really could cover all sorts of things without really hitting the nail on the head, if you get my meaning.
Yeah, I'm sure we can give you some more depth around that. The only observation I'd make is the commitment to get to 5%, which is this 3.5% core, 1.5% additional, is not until the 2030s. So what we won't be able to give you is the detailed kind of spending decisions for those years, because those have not happened yet. But we could give you a sense of what we're currently spending.
But in broad brush terms, don't we need to distinguish between what we're spending dealing with natural disasters and what we're spending to try to deal with hybrid threats or other more aggressive acts? To have a breakdown between those categories would be incredibly helpful, wouldn't it?
Mm. And we look at the National Risk Register in the round when these decisions are taken, so that's why we talk about climate risk as well as biosecurity risk or hybrid risk and some of the other things that you've mentioned.
Will it be helpful to get that? And just very quickly, finally, the National Security Strategy talks about a whole of society preparedness to deal with the scale of the security challenges we're facing. But if we're being honest with each other, it doesn't really feel at the moment, does it, that we're in the middle of some national mobilization effort. How are you going to get from the rhetoric about whole society response to actually delivering it? Because we seem to be quite a long way off that.
I think that's probably right. I think the public are alive to what's happening in the world. They probably, I assume, think a lot of the things we talk about are quite far away. But actually, we've been clear, whether it's through public statements to Parliament or the recent speeches from intelligence agency heads, that we have lots of threats near at home as well, on hybrid, on cyber, in the North Sea, and so on and so forth. Our increase in defence spending and the commitment we've made, I think, has illustrated that for the public. But I do think you're right. We probably need to go further on preparedness at home, whether it's for climate risk or other risks. We are a bit behind now our European partners on how we provide information to the public. So we set out lots of information on gov.uk prepare that supports people to think about, if the power goes out at home, what might you want to do in advance to be able to go about your kind of lives whilst you're waiting for it to be switched back on. But am I convinced that everyone goes on gov.uk/prepare to prepare? No. And so I think we probably need to go a bit further than we currently do.
Lord Sebel.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Secretary, just on this 1.5%, building on Lord Hutton's question, what new or additional capabilities are we going to have as a result of it? Because it does feel as though it's a basket that contains quite a lot of stuff that we already do. So what new or additional capabilities would you highlight?
So just to stress the point I made previously, the commitment to 1.5% as part of the broader commitment to hit 5% of GDP in the 2030s is subject to future spending reviews. So I can't tell you today precisely what line item decisions the government has taken to hit the commitment that we've made to reach in the 2030s. In terms of what we're spending today on resilience, there's a whole host of spending across government, as say, whether it's on biosecurity research capabilities, supporting damage to undersea cables. We've talked about climate resilience issues, which have been allocated in this spending review. But the headline commitment to 1.5 as part of the 5%, as I say, is something for the future that we've not made detailed decisions on just yet.
Well, sorry, it isn't, is it? Because you've said that you'll be at 1.5 by 2027. And so I want to understand what, by 2027, we will have that is new or additional capability to improve the resilience of this country. Yeah, I worked for NATO. I was National Security Advisor. I'm very familiar with all the accounting games that can be played to shovel things in to meet the NATO definitions. So what I want to understand here is, in terms of that, by 2027, you should know that, what new or additional capabilities are going to be delivered as part of that? Or is it simply drawing a line around a whole load of existing capabilities and calling them resilience?
So the current spending review gets us to that target by 2027. What that spending is on is what is in the spending review right now. So to the point in your question about new or additional, anything that's new or additional outside of the current spending review is subject to future spending reviews. Those decisions have already been taken as part of SR25. The answer I gave to the chair of the Defence Select Committee was that on the existing definitions that NATO have for us, based on current spending in the current spending review, we do think we will get to that target earlier than the requirement to hit 1.5 as part of the broader 5 in the 2030s.
So there isn't anything you would like to highlight from SR25 as additional capabilities, resilience capabilities this government has delivered? It's go find the spending review and have a look.
Well, there's lots of items in the spending review that we're currently spending money on, but I wouldn't describe them to be true to your question, Lord Sedwell, as new or additional, is what we're doing right now, as opposed to something on top of what we've already agreed to do.
All right, thank you.
Lord Tunnicliffe.
You may have just answered this question, but can we make it very simple? When you come to present the 1.5% at some point and say we've done it, to what extent within that 1.5% is there likely to be things that we've already done and we are doing?
So the 1.5% equivalent spending by 2027 will be things that we are now currently doing, because it's in the current spending settlement. We're currently doing it, and we're currently spending money on it out of current budgets. The question after the review in 2029, when you're trying to then stack up the 5% commitment, may look different because it will be subject to future spending reviews. The next one, as I said, will happen in 2027.
I'm sorry, I'm not listening very well, obviously. Did you say that the 1.5% will be covered by things we're already doing?
We will hit the equivalent of 1.5% of additional spending under current NATO definitions based on what we're currently doing in the current budget settlements by 2027, yes. But we've made a commitment to get to 5% in the 2030s to NATO. All I'm saying is that might look different at that point because of future spending reviews which have not yet happened.
I think you're saying what we are doing now will take us to the answer we're required to give, and it's all just a matter of packaging it.
But it's using existing NATO definitions against the current spending settlements.
I think you may have some trouble convincing the general public that that's additional capability.
I'm not suggesting it is additional capability right now. What I'm saying is additional capability will come in future years when there's increased spending through future spending reviews.
Okay. I think it's something that Lord Ricketts was saying to us, which was that the public should have some accounting for how the billions are spent. So I think maybe there is a lot in that. If we are going to take the public with us, then we need to give them some visibility of actually what really we're delivering as a country. Lord Watts.
This one for you, Mr. Jarvis. The Intelligence Security Committee described China as having aggressive targeting the UK's national security. What would China have to do to be placed in the enhanced tier of the foreign influence registration scheme?
Well, I've lost count of how many statements and responses to urgent questions I've given on this particular subject. I mean, specifically on FIRS. FIRS is a relatively new capability. We introduced it on the 1st of July, although it officially went live on the 1st of October. I think it will be quite a useful capability, but it is still relatively early days. And as the committee will be aware, we've already agreed to put both Russia and Iran on the enhanced tier, and we're looking very closely at the detail of how that's working at the moment. I mean, the government's line with regard to China is clear. There has been an active debate, put it in that way, around the planning application that was made by China, and a decision was taken by the Secretary of State last week. But I can give you an assurance, specifically with regard to the embassy, that based on the advice that we have received, and you will have seen the letter from the Director General of MI5 and from GCHQ, and you will have noted the point about the consolidation of the existing diplomatic estate in London, we think that that is the right way to proceed. But I can give you an absolute assurance that national security is the top priority for this government, and we will guard against the threats that we face wherever they come from.
Well, let's just delve a bit into the relationship between ourselves and China. I was amazed at the Trade Committee to find out that the trade negotiators were not considering the issues of security or even human rights. They were purely trying to do a trade deal. Now, is that changed for now? With the threats that we now face, when we're looking to do trade deals, does it mean that we take a wider view about the benefits and the problems that will come from that trade deal? Because it might seem to some of our constituents that we are boosting the trade, for example, in China, who then spend more money on their military capability, and then we have to spend more to actually catch up with them. It seems to be very naive to start to develop trade policies with people who you can't rely on.
I can assure you it is the opposite of naive. We have a very clear-eyed approach when it comes to China. So where there are areas where it is in our national interest to cooperate and work closely with them, then we will do so. But when it's in our national security interest to safeguard against the threats that we pose, we will absolutely do that. So I think that the public will understand that we do need to make the most of economic opportunities, and on areas like economic cooperation, on climate change, but also on other important areas as well, whether that's narcotics trafficking, whether that's organised immigration crime, whether that's serious organised crime. I think it's entirely reasonable to engage in a way that is in our national interest. And by the way, that's what our allies do. That's what the French, Germans, and a range of other nations do as well. But in terms of safeguarding our national security, that is always going to be a priority, and we'll always make sure that we've got the right tools and the right resources in place to guard against that particular threat.
Well, I understand the point you're making, but for example, if you take the trade deals that we have with China, China has managed to actually do very well out of that and is boosting its defences. Over the last few years, we've been not doing the same because we haven't had the capabilities. So by developing trade with China, and not just China, many other countries, without looking at the implication about how that boosts their own economy and how that would impact on our defence and our security.
Well, I think you're right. We absolutely have to look at these things in the round. But I think context to our relationship as it is at the moment is that the previous government went from a very close relationship, then essentially to a kind of a very distant relationship. And I think it is much more sensible and pragmatic to have a consistent approach to deal with China in the areas where it's in our mutual interest to do so, but underscored by an absolute desire to protect our national security, and that is the basis on which we proceed.
What more can be done in higher education to beat off the threats from China that we've seen in recent past? What action is the government taking? What advice is given to universities and higher education establishments about how to be wary about some of the players that they're dealing with?
I think that's an entirely fair challenge, and next week the Minister of State at the Department for Education and myself will be meeting with all of the Vice-Chancellors of our university to discuss that particular point. We recognise both the opportunities and the threats that international cooperation faces within the education sector, and we're working closely across government to make sure that we're best placed to make the most of the opportunities, whilst at the same time safeguarding against the threats that we face.
Finally, you've mentioned the Chinese embassy. What measures have you taken to assure the public that that facility is not going to be used to actually make the security situation worse than it is at the moment?
Well, I know that you will understand and the committee will understand that we're not going to get into the technical mitigations and the things that we're specifically going to do to ensure that we're able to safeguard our security. But the letter that was sent by the Director Generals of MI5 and GCHQ made clear that there were security advantages from the consolidation of the existing estate. And I've been very clear to the House previously that there are national security advantages from a drawdown of a diplomatic estate in London that currently consists of 7 sites down to 1. So whilst I recognise there are strong views about this, albeit not always informed by the facts of the case, I can give you and the committee an absolute assurance that we've looked very carefully at the nature and the detail of the national security challenges that we will face as a consequence of this proposal, and we are satisfied that we've got appropriate mitigations in order to counter them.
Does that take into account the seller, the massive seller in the Chinese, which I think people are concerned about?
Well, I again refer you, Lord Watts, to the point about the consolidation of the estate. We currently have 7 diplomatic sites in London, and we will move from 7 down to 1. There are clear national security advantages as a consequence of doing so.
Does the size of the seller, does that not give added or new threats to the UK?
Well, I made the point in Parliament the other day that the government, despite some of the reporting to the contrary, had been privy to the precise plans and the detail of the planning application that had been considered by the Secretary of State. I think countries are entitled to have embassies, and I reiterate the point about this particular country having reached an agreement with the British government to draw down its diplomatic footprint from 7 to 1. There are clear national security advantages of them doing so.
Minister, just on FIRS, Jonathan Hall Casey, who's the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, feels, and I quote, "There is quite a strong case that China should be placed in the enhanced tier." Is he wrong?
Well, I have huge respect for Mr. Hall, as I'm sure that the committee does, and I always listen very carefully to the recommendations he makes, not least the recommendations that he has made with regard to state prescription tools, and the government have offered commitments in that particular regard. I mean, FIRS is an important tool. It is a new tool, and we're looking very closely at how it's going to work with regard to Iran and Russia. I would just make the point, though, that we have a range of capabilities, and FIRS is just one of those. So any announcements that we have to make with regard to future designations, we'll bring forward to Parliament in the normal way.
Dame Emily.
So back to resilience and security at home. There's going to be a UK Resilience Academy set up, whose job is going to be to scrutinise the preparedness of public sector bodies. I wondered, though, aren't you concerned about its limited powers and the fact that it's not on a statutory footing? Do you think that it's going to be strong enough in order to be able to drive real change? And don't you think you should look again at the COVID inquiry's recommendation that it is put on a statutory footing?
So I'm not currently concerned about it being on a statutory footing or otherwise. No one's made the direct case to me that it needs to be in order to deliver the services that it's being set up to deliver. I think the key thing...
Wouldn't it be better if it's independent?
Independent of government, you mean, Chair? Again, unless the committee advises otherwise, it's an organisation that's seeking to upskill, train, and bring collaboration between different parts and functions of government, which I think is important, because you don't just want some people in the National Security Secretariat to be the resilience people. You want people across government in all of its different forms to be able to think about these types of issues. And so I think it's a good endeavour. Obviously, we will keep it under review, but I'm not entirely convinced at this stage that independence or statutory footings would add any additional value compared to the mandate it's already been given. But I don't rule it out in the future if it's something that we need to reconsider.
I want to also ask you about foreign interference and disinformation, because it's something that the Foreign Affairs Committee has been studying, and it's quite clear from countries around the world that this doesn't just happen when elections are happening. There's a build-up in advance. And so I know that there has been legislation passed, and I know that there are various cells and task force and so on. But what I want to do really is look at it this way. So it's been established that there were 1,300 Iranian bots pretending to be Scottish nationalists. And that when the internet went down recently, they all went. And in the summer, when the Iran was being bombed, they all went down. So has anything been done about them? I mean, if something hasn't, what mechanism is there for taking it down? What offence have they committed? How is it proved? Who does the reporting? And how does it get taken down?
So, I think the first part of my answer is to ask for forgiveness for not knowing too much of the internal workings of DCIT, who...
it's a shame they're not here, really.
Point taken. It's because I'm trying to answer the question. Because, of course, the department is the department that operationalises a lot of these issues. To the point of principle that you're making, though, which is this a problem and is it getting worse?
No, let's assume it is a problem and it is getting worse.
Okay, well, we agree.
What are we doing about it is actually the question.
So the election interference review that Philip Rycroft is doing for the government is currently looking across departments and looking at the intelligence available to answer this question: should we be doing more? Now, I don't want to prejudge his findings, but my sense is the answer is yes, and that as we face into the future, this is going to become a bigger problem that we need to be very clear-eyed about. Are our current capabilities good enough? Could they be scaled in order to meet that challenge? Do we need to do something differently? I'm waiting for the Rycroft review to give us some suggestions on that, and then we'll be able to look at it.
Sorry to interrupt you, but the Rycroft review is about elections, right? So let's take another example. So the 2024 Southport attacks after the little girls were murdered. There were race riots across Britain, and they were amplified by foreign interference. Now, if that was to happen tomorrow, what would we do about it? How could we stop it?
In respect of Southport and also events that followed, the government did use the laws it has available to...
What laws are those?
in the Online Safety Act, but also traditional criminal law about stirring racial hatred and all those types of issues, where the government and the Crown Prosecution Service and the police made, I think, record numbers of arrests and judgments in court for breaking those laws online in a way that had not been the case before. And there was some criticism of the government for that, but it was applying the rule that if it's illegal in the real world, it's illegal online too. The Online Safety Act is, of course, it took a very long time, but it is broadly new. The regulator's just stepping up into that at the moment. But to go to the nub of your question, do I think that is sufficient? I'm not currently persuaded that it is entirely sufficient, and that yes, we will need to do more in the future.
Did you see, for example, on the Southport attacks, it was able to prosecute people who were in Britain who were inciting violence. But what I'm asking about is foreign interference in the UK that undermines I'm reading from the National Security Strategy, threatens social cohesion and it seeks to erode public trust through the spread of disinformation. Now, it's a top-line threat in the National Security Strategy, but I fail to see a response, if I'm being completely honest, which meets the level of that threat. I mean, you talk about the Online Safety Act. People say, I don't quite understand how it works, but people say that there is power in it to take down content. I don't know how that works, but perhaps the better way to ask it is, has it ever been used?
So some of the powers have started to be used.
Has it been used for foreign interference?
On foreign interference, I do not know the answer.
Could you tell us? Could you find out and tell us?
I will do my best to do so. But the powers are there, and the cells that you've referred to earlier, that, as I say, DCIT operates certainly around election periods, essentially highlight these issues with the relevant companies to have them taken down.
There's no obligation on the companies to do that, is there? I mean, as I understand it, their duty is to operate the service with systems designed to take down priority illegal material where alerted to its existence. Well, I don't even know what that means.
I think in practice what it means is that if the government raises something with a platform that it says and shows is illegal, the companies are then required to take it down. The difficult debate is when it's not illegal or could be alleged to not be illegal but is evidently harmful. This is something that Parliament spent many, many years trying to articulate and was unable to do so in the Online Safety Act because it is a difficult concept in law to be able to legislate for. But these are the types of issues that the government is very alive to go to the concern.
And you appreciate that there is a response gap. As Rusi, in fact, has talked about. One department focuses on the platform regulation, another on public messaging, another on tracking agencies. It's very difficult to kind of know who is responsible for this, which is why at least Rusi, and I know others have too, have called for a national disinformation agency whose job would be to be able to track, regulate, and keep close to the public, to social media, in order to ensure that our democracies are not being undermined.
So on coordination across government, in fact, Dan Jarvis coordinates for us through the Defending Democracy Task Force, which was something that the previous government established. I'm sure Dan would happily answer any questions on the task force. So to the idea of a new...
Defending Democracy Task Force taking down any content that is being pushed by other countries to try to undermine our democracy right now.
So CSPM is right. The fulcrum point for this activity across government is the Defending Democracy Task Force, which brings different government departments together with law enforcement. It would be a decent lead in terms of the response to the OSA. I would also just point out that before Christmas, I spoke about the work of the Counter-Political Interference and Espionage Action Plan, which is specifically in place to disrupt and deter this kind of activity. So we do work very closely across government. We welcome the work that your committee is doing. I know that Minister Doughty has been in correspondence with you, and I'm about to write to you as well. But the DDTF is the kind of fulcrum point that will coordinate that activity across government.
Can I ask one final question? So, there is another one. There's Reddit, for example. So on Reddit, a few years ago. I don't know have the numbers right in front of me, but on Reddit a few years ago, the words London, unsafe, and violent were used about 400 times in a year, and then last year it was 400,000 times. I mean, there is a campaign to try to undermine the standing of our capital city and to frighten its residents. And those words are being used by Reform. And the new mayoral candidate used those lines. Now, there is something going on, and all I'm saying to those responsible for the Defending Democracy Task Force is, can you do something about this, please? And how are you going to do it? And how are you going to tackle Reddit and make sure that this doesn't happen? Because they're spreading lies, and it gets under people's skin. I mean, even the President of the United States thinks that it's not safe to walk the streets of London. And yet we have the best, if there is such a word, if we have the I don't know how to, it isn't the best, but our murder, the number of murders happening now in London have never been lower than they are now, not since records began.
So I think you're right.
I'm right.
It is it's a very challenging situation that we're dealing with. That's precisely why, along with MHCLG, we commissioned the Rycroft review, and we think that provides a very good opportunity to shine a light on these particular issues. I think it's also worth me just making the point that where this interference impacts on the electoral process, I know you were talking about a kind of more wider general sort of nature of the threat, but where it specifically impacts on the electoral process, and you mentioned another political party, we have got JESP, the Joint Election Security and Preparedness Unit, which sits in the Cabinet Office and works very closely both with MHCLG and with the Electoral Commission. It is my intention to provide a further update in due course about the work of the Defending Democracy Task Force, because I do think that you raise a very important issue. We are looking at what more we can do. There is a very important conversation that has to be had with the tech companies as well. We think the Rycroft review provides a very good format for actually looking at the activity and making sure that our response is proportionate.
Will the Rycroft review accept, presumably appreciate, that its remit is much longer than just a few months? What we learned in Romania and Moldova was that the manipulation takes place at least a year before an election.
Absolutely, and recognising the urgency of this particular work, the Rycroft review will report by the end of March in order to inform future legislation.
Edwin Morello.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not entirely sure that the President of the United States isn't correct in thinking it's not safe for him to walk around the streets of London. Just to follow on from what the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee was saying, that a lot of the evidence that the Foreign Affairs Committee has taken is about the fact that attempts to undermine the democratic process in countries starts a lot longer than the electoral period. The Electoral Commission itself, their powers only kick in at the point of the short campaign being kicked off. So a lot of what the responses that both of you have given in response to this are time linked to our own electoral cycle. And I guess my question is that outside of those periods, and if the reviews and the powers, especially the Electoral Commission, are all centred around that, we are fundamentally losing the fight before it's already begun. So do the current regulations, especially around the powers of the Electoral Commission, do they need expanding beyond just the remit of the short campaign to cover a longer period of time?
Well, let me say I accept the basic premise of your question that we need to be looking at activity well in advance of electoral moments. And that's precisely why I've been looking at this since the 6th of July 2024, and why, to give you one example, we're doing work now ahead of the Northern Ireland elections that will be taking place in 2027, because you're right, there is a very long time lag with these kind of activities. I think in truth we didn't see the levels of mis and disinformation and interference in the previous general election that perhaps we might have expected. Now, there are reasons why I think that was the case. But I can give you an assurance that in the context of the Defending Democracy Task Force, we have a standing item where we review the kind of mechanisms and the procedures that are in place to ensure that the elections, the next set of elections that are taking place, and clearly we've got important elections taking place in Scotland, Wales and England in May of this year, are being properly safeguarded against. But I would just draw you back again to the work of the Rycroft Review. It is because of our concern about this activity that we think it's right to have an independent view, and that's why we think that Philip Rycroft is the right person to look carefully at this, to make recommendations into government, and clearly we'll look very carefully at what he says.
We must move on. Baroness Kidron.
Yes. Just on this point, the government has just announced a review that looks at some parts of the OSA, the Online Safety Act, and I'm wondering whether it might have another look at mis and disinformation in that context as well as in the security context, because I think that what everybody's saying is it's a Venn diagram of problem. You know, there are foreign state interference and there's bot farms, but there is also a lot of social issues and problems with it. And I wonder whether you might take that back to your friends at DCIT who are not here. But if I could just turn to the Cyber Action Plan, which is focused on improving public sector cyber resilience by March 2027. There's been a bit of a pushback, shall we say, from the National Audit Office, which is sort of doubting long-term government failures in this space. And I just really wanted to ask the question, what's different? What's going to be different this time?
Let me start with a positive point, because CSPM was talking about the machinery of government change that was enacted back in September last year. And I think cyber is an important area that lends itself to having that kind of cross-departmental coordination. And that's one of the reasons why I now sit in the Cabinet Office and the Home Office. And as I think CSPM will testify, this is something that between us we consider to be incredibly important. I do just want to start with a kind of a positive point about it, because I think it's worth making the point that the UK's cyber security sector is absolutely vital for economic growth and has contributed 13.2 billion in revenue over the financial year 2023 to 2024 and employs 67,300 people. So I'm quite keen to sort of shift this assertion that cyber activity will always have a negative impact on our economy. There is a more positive story to tell. But in terms of the nature of the threat that we're facing, and people will be familiar with the attack that we saw on Jaguar Land Rover, on Marks and Spencer's and the Co-op, there is a lot of activity that's taking place across government to make sure that we're properly coordinating the response. So in terms of the National Cyber Action Plan, so this is based on 3 key pillars. So countering the threat, strengthening resilience, and securing economic growth. And we've made a commitment to publish a refreshed National Cyber Action Plan in the spring, building on what was there previously. We had a strategy and we're converting that into an action plan. I think it would be impossible to overstate the importance with which we attach to this activity. And that's why I work very closely with ministerial colleagues across government and with our operational partners and with law enforcement to make sure that the nature of the response that we face is proportionate to the nature of the threat. We also collaborate very closely with our international allies, both in terms of Five Eyes, G7 and European partners as well. So it's a key priority for me in government, and we're making sure that we're doing everything that we can to respond in a robust and proportionate way.
Thank you for that, and I'm glad you started with something positive. I would like to ask just about the funding for this, and I'd like to ask from 2 perspectives. One is there going to be adequate funding to actually make, the public sector safe? Yeah, is that going to be a priority? And the other thing is, really, to your point, we do have a very strong cybersecurity sector here in the UK, but are we going to actually look at procurement as a way of strengthening that sector, or are we going to see yet more government procurement going to the big tech, which in itself creates a certain level of insecurity, I might say?
Let me say a couple of things. Firstly, you will be aware, I'm sure, of the work that is being done, led by DCIT in terms of the Cyber Security and Resilience Bill. So this is a really important piece of government legislation, which we're working very closely with them on. In terms of your point around procurement, I think that is a point well made, and we're working closely with colleagues across government, including with DBT, and I met with Minister Bryant recently just to ensure that we're as joined up as we think that we need to be. Let me just say, if I may, a word about ransomware, because as I'm sure you will know, the government has consulted extensively on ransomware proposals. I am determined to ensure that alongside our allies, we're doing everything that we can to disrupt and deter the ransomware attacks that we're seeing on a daily basis, which not only undermine our national security, but also our economic security as well. So I'm keen to ensure that we've got an appropriate legislative response to the ransomware attacks that we face, because I think that will be good for our national security, but good for our economy as well. But the best way to do that is in concert with our allies, and that's why the recent G7 meeting, we took this specifically as an agenda item, and we're looking at what more we can do, both with Five Eyes partners and with G7 allies as well.
And going to the Cyber Security and Resilience Bill, I think that when we looked at that, we were surprised how narrow it was. And we've actually had quite a lot of evidence come in saying, you know, that, okay, it includes critical sectors like data centres, but it leaves whole other sectors out. And I just wondered whether we're missing an opportunity, given that we've got a live bill, to actually think more fully about, you know, how security really stacks up in the food chain, in the technological food chain.
I think that is a fair challenge. Clearly, it would be, forgive me, for DCIT to account for the contents of their bill.
We are missing them.
But I wasn't seeking to emphasise that point. Apologies to ministerial colleagues in DCIT. But I think our response does have to be considered in the round. So legislation is a really important part of that, but there are other tools, other measures that we can use to ensure that we have that kind of full spectrum response. That is a priority for us. We're working very closely with our colleagues, both in the Foreign Office, in the Ministry of Defence, and with DCIT, and with other government departments and operational partners as well, to ensure that we are best prepared to guard against the nature of the threat that we face, not least given the terrible attacks we've seen in recent time.
Can I just comment on that? Are you surprised that the EU in its NIS legislation is far more comprehensive than what we're proposing?
Well, we have made commitments to legislate in other areas. So in terms of the points that I'd made about ransomware, we've gone through an exhaustive process of consultation, and we've made commitments to legislate with regard to that when parliamentary time allows. So there are other commitments that the government has made out with the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, but of course we need to work very closely with our allies and look at what colleagues in the European Union are doing.
So one of the other commitments you made is to the Sovereign AI Unit, and I think it's 500 million. And I'd like to ask the CDR, what level of this will be around national security? And I think I'd like to ask what your definition of sovereignty is, because there is some concern that that's dominated by US interests.
So I don't think we have a written down definition of sovereignty, but the way I would articulate it is that we want to ensure that we have the skills, capabilities and control over key infrastructure and assets in the United Kingdom. And this is an important part of the national security strategy, not least on current technologies, but also future technologies where we have a comparative advantage, for example, on quantum computing and its implications or potential implications for these technologies as well. I would say as well that if you look at the overall spending on digital and IT over the spending review period, we did increase it compared to previous trends by billions of pounds, partly to reflect the fact that the cyber risk needed to be dealt with. And there have been a number of security breaches over previous years, not least due to legacy IT systems in certain departments that were in desperate need of being upgraded, but also to ensure that where you have kind of back office IT systems in government departments, you're upgrading the whole of Whitehall as part of what's called the Shared Services Programme. So at the moment, and again, this is a programme started under the last government, but we put more money into it as the current government to accelerate the rollout of it. Many departments might have their HR systems or their finance systems or other types of kind of corporate function systems within their own departments, and they could be many decades old in some cases. That makes it an easier target for cyber criminals and others who want to try to hack into government systems. So our shared services program is currently bringing departments together to have more modern, more secure shared back office systems to challenge some of those issues. What that means, though, is that a lot of the spending is loaded into dealing with old computers, basically, because the state was so far behind the private sector as a comparator as to where it ought to be. And so that means we're trying to speed up the kind of the transition from legacy IT, whilst also putting money into frontier technologies where we can. But we've definitely got some catching up to do in government compared to the private sector in the UK.
I think, and finally, I'm just very aware that Europe has started to work out that maybe it needs its own AI stack, and it needs to work out where the choke points are, and it needs to create at least enough sovereignty to prevent, to have something to put on the table, to have a deal on the table. And I'm just concerned whether in the desire to catch up, whether we're making strategic decisions to make sure that we totally own some of the choke points rather than just pile money into frontier systems that may or may not actually help the UK.
Yes, and it's coming up to a year since the Prime Minister launched the AI Opportunities Action Plan. I've seen a progress report on that, which is very good. I think we're going to be trying to say more about that in public very soon, but it essentially goes to the heart of this question. I don't think as a country we would be able to do end-to-end from chip fabrication and design all the way through to kind of consumer products, but there are definitely parts of the value chain where we've got great capabilities in the UK for ourselves, but also for our allies, and on frontier technologies where we definitely punch above our weight in terms of innovation and startup companies. And so to go back to my point on comparative advantage as well as sovereign capability, we do factor all of those considerations into spending decisions and areas of priority work.
Thank you.
Edward Morello.
Thank you, Chair. It is clear from the US national security strategy and defence strategy that there is a serious misalignment now between American strategy and UK national security strategy. And I'm wondering whether or not, under the current administration, you believe that the US continues to be a reliable partner to the UK, and whether the UK should still be making security, national security and defence decisions based on the past behaviour of the US or previous administrations.
So the United States is a reliable partner, and we have every confidence that it will continue to be. As one of the Five Eyes countries, as well as on terms of military cooperation, we still collaborate very, very closely every day of the week in order to protect British interests and the interests of our allies around the world. I recognise there's a lot of kind of geopolitical noise happening right now, but as I said on television the other day, I'm keen to reassure people that on day-to-day operations where we are acting to protect our country and our interests, they continue to happen in the normal way.
On day-to-day operations, I mean, we have supposedly, reportedly, a limited intelligence sharing with the US in relation to strikes on drug smugglers. The US national security strategy talks about a pivot away from European security. We've also seen the President of the United States threatening a NATO, the sovereign territorial integrity of a NATO ally. So, I mean, actually there obviously has been serious implications in the day-to-day relationship with the US. I'm wondering whether or not the government is thinking about the need to diversify its security relations, pivot away from a reliance on the US, especially in terms of its supply chains for its defense capabilities and nuclear capabilities? I mean, is there at least some kind of conversation going on internally within government about whether or not business can continue as usual and what the risks are associated with making that decision?
I think on the kind of first point of your question, our relationship with the United States, and quite frankly the relationship with the Prime Minister and the President of the United States, means that we can and do have frank conversations if we disagree with each other as friends and allies, which was evidently the case in respect of Greenland and Denmark, and I'm pleased that President Trump has confirmed that he does not intend to take forward any form of military action or tariff reaction to his views on Greenland. We were able to have that robust conversation with each other whilst continuing to collaborate. As you see from our Strategic Defence Review and the National Security Strategy, we don't just want to ensure that we have domestic capabilities for war readiness, but that we are a leader in NATO, which obviously includes the United States. So that means that we, as an important partner in NATO with other NATO members, are deepening our collaboration. We agree that Europe collectively needs to increase its defence capabilities. We agree that in the High North we also need to increase our military presence given the melting ice caps and the militarisation of the Russian border. So there's a lot of agreement on these points, and actually that turns into often benefits for the UK. I point to perhaps an obvious example, but the frigate deal with the Norwegians to ensure that we have additional capability for keeping an eye out for submarines and protecting critical national infrastructure is important for security, but is also guaranteed 10 years of work in shipyards in Scotland for people to build the frigates that are being ordered. So there is collaboration across Europe. There is an agreement that we do need to do more with our European partners as part of a set of arrangements within NATO. And we continue to try to broker those deals in the interest of the UK economy as well as our security requirements.
It's from the outside, one might look and see when you've got this issue of, we'll wake up on any given Monday wondering what's going to appear on Truth Social, and we've got tariffs, 10% tariffs being imposed, seemingly ad hoc, in threat. That actually, while the government is trying to balance a desire to sign a US trade deal, and at the same time we might be making procurement decisions based on further integration or continuing integration with US defence suppliers, that we just create additional vulnerabilities to the current President of the United States deciding to try and leverage any of those relationships to exert influence on us when it comes to the foreign policy or national security decisions that we're making in the UK.
We will always take foreign policy and military decisions in the interests of Britain and of our values and the commitments that we've made to allies. And we've been very clear about that in public, whether that message is for friends or foes. We won't deviate from that. The Prime Minister was very clear on that in Prime Minister's questions last week when he said he will not yield from that position that the public expect us to take, and will continue to take it. But to the kind of broader point that you're making, do we want to build partnerships with others around the world? Yes, absolutely. We're doing a lot of work, as I say, with European countries, with France and Germany as the E3, which is an important grouping now in order to how we navigate through some of these geopolitical challenges. But also if you look at our relationship with the Australians, with AUKUS, we've committed to that programme that we inherited from the previous government because we think it's important. An important and growing relationship with Japan and with others as well shows that we are building those bilateral and multilateral agreements around the world in the interest of the UK, but also as part of our contribution to NATO. And so far we're kind of balancing those interests, and I think in the context of lots of challenges in the world, I think doing a reasonably good job.
Lord Sebel.
Thank you. Minister, can I just test you on the two national security strategies? So ours was published last summer, theirs in December, and they've just published their essentially defence response to it, the United States, that is. And you said at the beginning of this session you felt the UK national security strategy essentially stood the test of time, at least so far. You just set that out. But the truth is that they take some very divergent views of some of the crucial threats. Ours absolutely centred on the acute threat from Russia. Theirs downplays it. And of course, we have a robust dialogue on all of those things. We always have. I was there throughout the first Trump administration, and that was true then too. But fundamentally, we take a different view of some of the most acute threats. And indeed, we heard from the Vice President that the greatest threat he was worried about in Europe was within European societies, not the external threat from Russia, when he spoke a year ago at the Munich Security Conference. How do you reconcile all of that?
Well, I disagree with that view. I think we're very clear in our strategies and in public and in the decisions that we take that Russia is our primary threat in Europe, as well as others that we articulate in the documents, and that we will act on that basis. I think the challenge with any national security strategy document, as you will know better than I, is that you're never going to get a 100% perfect document that then doesn't have to reflect or be nimble around what happens in the world, often weeks or months after it. So you want to create a strategy that, by design, pulls together all the different parts of government into a coherent strategic view for the purposes of the National Security Council and to aid our decision making, whilst recognising the fact that, of course, you need to be able to manoeuvre about what really happens in the world when you're going from week to week and month to month.
But I think, can we just pursue this point a bit? I'm actually in Norway. The reason I'm dressed a bit informally, I'm in Norway today with the UK Commando Force. I decided not to be in uniform for this because it would be a bit distracting. Seeing actually for real exactly what you were talking about, which is operations, exercises with the Norwegians, absolutely shoulder to shoulder, in order to rehearse what we would do if we ended up in a pre-Article 5 situation, and indeed, of course, to hopefully deter the Russians from behaving recklessly in the High North. And you're very familiar with those issues. So I'm glad you mentioned Norway. If we just take a step back, go to the United States, they set out their priorities, and if we remove the language of the Trump administration, their priorities were homeland security, Western Hemisphere, China, Pacific, Middle East, Euro-Atlantic. But that order of priorities could easily have been the order of priorities from a more conventional administration, because they reflect the world as the United States now sees it. So whether it's because the United States has a sort of an isolationist president, which it might in the future, I don't, by the way, think this one is, or because there's a crisis in the Pacific with China, they can no longer spread themselves to be able to deal with two at once, given the scale of the challenge they face with China. As you've sort of acknowledged, Europe needs to do more in our own defence, because the Americans might be unwilling, isolationism, or unable, China, to provide the same level of support they've provided hitherto. The question for you is timing. You've set out a trajectory. We've got commitments to 3% and 3.5%, etc., as do the other Europeans. The problem is those are not moving at the pace of events. Question mark. Do you agree?
Do I think that the risk picture that we face warrants us having to think more short to medium term than we have done in the past? The answer is yes, I do. One of the reasons the Defence Investment Plan is important is not just to think about how we allocate additional spending in the future, but is to challenge ourselves to make sure that current spending is fit for purpose in meeting the threat that we're facing. And when we publish the Defence Investment Plan, which I'm conscious is late, but we are working on at the moment, I hope you'll see in the decisions there that we are thinking about the near medium term as well as the longer term, especially in terms of how we're allocating money to particular projects. We can't just allocate most of our capital budgets to projects that will become available in the 2040s or 2050s. We need to make sure that we are on a, as the SDR says, a war readiness footing much sooner than that, unfortunately.
So, I mean, in a sense, that illustrates the dilemma, that The Defence Investment Plan is late. We hear reports, you won't want to comment on them, that there's essentially the usual knife fight going on within defence over, in particular, the short-term components of that, because we know the situation is challenging. But there's investment in defence, there's integration of defence industrial capability across Europe, and there's interoperability between European NATO. We know we have 5 times as many systems in Europe as the Americans do, and it means we get much less bang for every buck that we spend, and we spend less anyway. A lot of that we could be moving out on with our European allies and demonstrating serious intent, and yet it still seems that neither we nor our European allies, I recognise obviously the complexities of this, are really leaning into this. That you see this in the share prices of defence companies going up and down every time there's an incident. There isn't yet a genuine belief out there that the Europeans, including the UK, European NATO, is really accelerating into this at the pace of events.
I think one of the reasons the Defence Investment Plan is taking perhaps longer is because, as I say, it's not just a decision on how to allocate additional spending. It is looking at the whole Defence Investment Plan for the reasons that I've set out, and I don't think that happens very often. One of the challenges, as the NAO and others have pointed out, is a lot of defence spending in the past has maybe not been spent as effectively as it ought to be, given the risk picture. So we're taking this opportunity to dive right into the detail and get through everything line by line for a reason, because we think it's important, and that's why it's taking a little bit longer. I think in terms of European partners, we're seeing a very significant increase on commitments in spending. Poland is a prime example, but also in Germany and in France and others. The question of a collaboration in Europe is, I don't need to tell the committee this, is obviously different in Europe because of the constitutional setup of the role of the European institutions and member states maintaining.
They won't let us into SAFE.
The defence questions for them, and of course it was disappointing that we were not able to take part in SAFE. We wanted to do so, and we are happy to have that conversation with Europe again if they would like us to do so, because we do think that there's more room for collaboration. I think we've shown a lot of progress with our partners in the Joint Expeditionary Force, in the JEF, where we continue to show how collaboration can happen without maybe the European institutions playing a direct role. But do I think we should be doing more? The answer is yes, but obviously there are lots of political challenges here that we need to try to manoeuvre whilst also delivering on our own commitments here at home.
I know we're short of time, and it's perhaps something to take in a different session. I just want to move on slightly to talk about Russia itself. The committee in our report on the undersea cables issue essentially highlighted an important point about deterrence, that there needs to be essentially an offensive element to deterrence as well as simply a defensive element. Otherwise, we end up, in a sense, falling into what one might describe as the Maginot Trap, that we're static and they're mobile, etc. And we were concerned that while we can make ourselves more resilient, that we don't really have an approach within the hybrid space to impose significant costs on Russia for their aggressive behaviour, and therefore we are not really deterring it. We're simply absorbing their attacks, and that's an illustration of a broader point as we're dealing with this sort of hybrid warfare that we know that we are facing. How confident are you that actually our doctrine is keeping up with this new, more complex way of dealing with a threat?
I think it's reflected adequately in the Strategic Defence Review, where it makes it very clear that whether it's an indirect or direct confrontation, we need to be alive to the fact that we expect that to become relevant more often in the future than it has done in the past. And as a consequence of that view, which, as I say, the government has published, what are the decisions we therefore need to take in order to respond to indirect or direct confrontation? I obviously shouldn't go into any personal views about how to respond to the particular things that you mentioned, but I think strategically it's on the page in the document we published, and we'll make decisions on that basis.
But we talk about attribution, but we don't really talk about imposing real penalties that would matter to the Kremlin. If we're thinking, for example, about undersea cables, and that's just a tactical example. Slightly different way of thinking about it. If we are on the ground in Ukraine as part of the coalition of the willing, and the Prime Minister has commendably taken a very strong lead on that, do we have an assessment of whether that puts us more in the crosshairs for more of this Russian activity?
The Ministry of Defence has been working with partners and with Ukraine on plans in advance of the political agreement that was signed recently by the Prime Minister, which are to the degree now where if we do need to deploy troops as part of that agreement, we are prepared and able to do so. And that work has considered risks in the round and what it might take from the Ministry of Defence and other partners to be able to honour the commitments that the Prime Minister has made.
This just final point, Chair, really just echoing the point you made earlier about taking the public with us. The public are conscious that the world is becoming more dangerous, and the Trump administration's approach to Greenland over the past week or so has put that on the front pages and at the top of the bulletins, obviously. But I don't think that they're conscious of this kind of balanced judgment. And there's just a question here about how do you take the public with you to say to them, we are doing this, it's the right thing to do. It probably means this country is at more risk from Russian aggression, and therefore we're going to have to do some other things as well, and that's going to involve some hard choices. I don't really hear that argument being made.
There's a very high level of support from the public in terms of our support for Ukraine. With another part of my job, I see frequent kind of polling and focus group feedback, and also what people are reading and talking about online as well as in the mainstream media. And all of the interventions around our support for Ukraine are broadly seen very positively by the public. Importantly, as the Prime Minister's committed to, if we do get to a position where the war ends and the coalition of the willing's commitments can be put into action, it will be subject to a vote in Parliament. So I suspect some of these issues might be debated around that time, and given the significance of it, will be seen and engaged with by the public.
Okay, interesting topic I'd like to pursue further, but we're out of time. Thanks.
Mike Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Secretary, given these differences of opinion with the US, this divergence, in terms of goals and aims, would you say that the UK is currently de-risking its relationship with the United States?
We continue to collaborate with the United States as we always have in our joint.
Would you say we're de-risking our relationship with them?
As I said, we continue the relationship we've had in the way that we've had it because it is beneficial and positive. I don't think there's anything wrong with the United States having a view about its own interests. Every country is entitled to do that. But if you look at our collaboration and cooperation in NATO and elsewhere, it has been and continues to be to the benefit of our country and to our allies. So there's no de-risking of that because NATO has been hugely successful in its operations and continues to be.
Forgive me. Of course, it's absolutely right and proper that any country can choose what their goals are, and that they've chosen slightly different goals to our goals. So I guess my question is, why aren't we de-risking our relationship with them if actually our goals are diverging somewhat? I'm not talking about a rupture, I'm talking about de-risking.
I don't accept the premise of de-risking. I think if what you're asking me is, do we therefore do more work with other partners in NATO where, for example, we have a local shared interest in European security, then the answer is yes, and we are.
That would be one way.
Ernest Tyler?
Thank you. Yes, just very briefly on this point, and I would just start by saying that in the light of recent events and comments by President Trump, I very much doubt that the majority of the British public actually do regard the US as a reliable partner. But it will be interesting to see what the polling says on that. But coming specifically to this point about diversifying international relationships, when the CDO was talking about this, I didn't hear him mention Canada, and I just wondered why that was in the light of the recent remarks by Mark Carney about the need for middle powers to be working together. And indeed, he did acknowledge what he described as a rupture in international relations. So could the CDO just comment on that, please?
We have an important relationship with Canada, as I know you and the committee will know, as do many other European partners. I think Prime Minister Carney's speech, which I think you're referring to, Baroness Tyler, was his views that the existing infrastructure around, for example, the United Nations, the Security Council, the Permanent Five, the kind of post-World War II settlement, in his view, needed to be superseded by other arrangements. I and the government don't share that view. We are committed to the rules-based order. We're committed to the United Nations, our role in the Security Council, whilst at the same time recognising its limitations. Where we agree is, I think it's probably both, as opposed to not doing the old stuff and doing the new stuff instead. So we've referred to a lot of those examples today. The E3, the JEF, AUKUS, our relationship with Japan. There are lots of bilateral and multilateral relationships that Britain has and contributes to around the world, whilst also playing our full part in the existing institutions that, acknowledging some of their limitations, we still think is an important part of the way in which the world operates.
Thank you.
Baroness Kidron.
Yes, sorry, I'm returning to the question of sovereignty again, and we got fantastic evidence from Air Commodore Blythe Crawford when he came, and also when he wrote, and I think it was on the back of what you said, which is we don't have it written down. And I think he was very much suggesting that we should have it written down, and that there should be different layers of sovereignty considered in, going forward, no sovereignty, partial, full, and different understandings of that. So if you took that on board, I'm just interested to know what capabilities need to be fully or partly sovereign. What do we need to hold on to in order to not have to have full sovereignty?
I suppose my point is that do we have a dictionary definition in government of sovereignty? No, but we do have the pieces of the puzzle. I mean, if you look at the industrial strategy, the sectors that are deemed to be priorities are priorities for a reason. If you look at the AI action plan, the reason we're interested in data centers and certain other types of capabilities is for a reason. These issues are either because we think sovereign capability is important, for example, our intervention on steel production in the UK and its importance to the defence capabilities, or because we think we've got comparative advantage, which is then strategically important to us as a sovereign offer to our allies and partners. So I suppose my point is we've not written a neat sentence, but are we taking decisions about what is important for sovereign capability? Yes, but it's pieced together in different places.
I just would say that there are certain parts of that pattern that have gone rather badly, like, in the industrial strategy, creative industries, but then there's training exceptions, and then also, there's some concern around NHS and access to NHS data and so on. And where is the sovereignty in all of that? So I think it would be an interesting if we had a shared understanding of what sovereignty meant.
Noted.
Thank you.
Baroness Fall.
Yes, we're mindful of time, so I'll just return to this sovereignty issue. I mean, obviously, economic nationalism, protectionism is the sort of name of the game. It's certainly increasing rather than diminishing. And so my question at the final end of this session is, are we doing enough in this area? When we think about sort of inward investment scrutiny with NS&I, we think about sort of intervention in small and medium-sized businesses and the support that we try to give them. If we think about supply chain resilience, this is changing all the time. Are you satisfied that in the government that you're doing enough to support?
I'm satisfied that there's a lot of activity on this issue, which is meeting a lot of those challenges, whether it's work that's happening in the Department for Business and Trade that do a lot of work on supply chains and those types of issues, or the work that I and we do in the Cabinet Office on screening for decisions that come under the National Security and Investment Act. And we also have discussions in other fora where there's interrelations between, for example, Energy Department questions and also questions of infrastructure security and those types of issues. So they are very live discussions that happen frequently, and we have tools and mechanisms to help us come to decisions where we have to take decisions as ministers that properly weight those concerns. And so on that basis, I am assured, yes.
Do you think that they're weighted too much in terms of sort of large infrastructure and not enough in thinking about, for example, our sort of startup culture and the way that our firms get sometimes picked off by American investors? Or should we be doing more to sort of nurture those businesses?
I don't have a concern around the scale of the business or the type of the business. I see issues every week on a whole range of things, including research and development or startups, all the way through to big infrastructure decisions. So from my engagement with the systems that we have, I wouldn't say to you that we have a particular focus on a type of asset class or a scale of business. You kind of see it across the spectrum, which I think is probably right.
With the investment scrutiny side of things, I mean, it's relatively new. How well do you think it's working, for example, compared to the CFIUS, the American version of that? Do you have a huge caseload? How do you triage it? Are you pleased with what we're doing so far?
It seems to work well. I was involved on the Parliament side when the legislation was enacted, and so I knew the Act pretty well coming into government. Now on the operational side, between Dan and I and our officials, as I say, we engage on this issue every week, but the team know that a lot of the time there are commercial and investment considerations here where we don't want the system to deter legitimate investment interest because of a system that is too opaque or takes too long or kind of is too burdensome in terms of regulation or outcome, and really does focus in on where it matters the most. And certainly the case files that I see every week give me reassurance that's being done in the right way. The team have done and are doing some reviews about the functioning and the future of the system, and we'll be able to say more on that shortly. But based on the evidence, I think the balance between making sure the UK is a place that people want to invest in and do business in, and the national security considerations seems to be working quite well from my perspective.
One more question, just if I may. Prime Minister's due to visit China this week. We did see that President Trump was not that pleased to hear that Mark Carney was planning to de-risk and head off and do some more deals with China. Are you expecting to have pushback from the Americans on the trip?
Well, I know that President Trump is due to go not long after the Prime Minister, so we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you.
This has been a fascinating session. It's so complex. And going back to one of my first points really about the workload, Chief Secretary, that you face, the fact this is across departments and is so multifaceted, so complex in terms of the challenges and the threats that we face. Do you have any sympathy for the view, which I think was put forward by the Defence Select Committee, which is that, as with other nations have done, we need to look at the establishment of some sort of Secretary or Minister for Homeland Security?
Well, we already have some of them. I mean, we have the Home Secretary, we have the Security Minister.
But a single entity.
You mean a department as opposed to a minister?
Yes.
Look, I think a lot of the issues we've talked about today you couldn't neatly put into one department because if you're talking about technology or defence spending or election regulation or cyber risk in public services or resilience spending in DEFRA, I mean, it's a kind of pervasive set of issues across government. So I'm always happy to hear ideas for how we might be able to improve, but I'm not sure trying to pull all of that into one place.
But if they had been here, if we had had such a unit, a department, they would have been able to answer the questions about some of the cyber threats and challenges that we face, and the fact that we have an absence of one department DSET today, it kind of illustrates the nature of the challenge and the problem that you have, doesn't it?
Look, I think the Cabinet Office is there to coordinate across government. That's what it was established to do. And this is an issue where we are collaborating across government. Is why we have the National Security Secretariat functions, the Joint Intelligence Committee and others in the centre, but working with our partners in defence and business and elsewhere. But I'm grateful for your concern for my well-being. One of the reasons I say that I was so pleased the Prime Minister agreed that Dan could come and be a minister in the Cabinet Office as well as the Home Office was because I recognise the challenge that you are painting given the mandate I was given at the last reshuffle.
Well, we will pick it up with DSET because it's been frustrating, evidently, in today's session not to have had them participate. And it's been quite clear that it's been difficult for yourselves to answer some of those questions that we've had. But that concludes today's session. I thank our witnesses for giving up their time. Thank you, and order.